This week, we welcome Kyle McNulty, founder and host of Secure Ventures, to discuss easy ways for businesses to become more resilient. In the leadership and communication section, 10 questions great bosses ask themselves, 5 cybersecurity traits for a successful career, 3 security priorities to support the new hybrid workplace, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Cyber risk and compliance automation is finally here. Legacy GRC systems cannot support the powerful, real-time automation and oversight that organizations require to take risks that matter to succeed. CyberSync continuous control automation ingests data from the IT GRC stack to update controls against regulatory requirements and risks in real time, delivering insights and visibility. See how members of the Fortune 500 are saving millions annually by visiting securityweekly.com/cybersync. People require access from anywhere to resources everywhere, but legacy security is ill-equipped for today's hybrid organization. Appgate SDP delivers zero-trust network access for hybrid workforces and workloads, empowering trusted users with secure, frictionless connections to only what they need. Make your attack surface invisible and reduce time to provision by 91% with Appgate SDP, a leader in the 2021 Forrester ZTNA New Wave. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Appgate. We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 238, recorded November 1st, 2021. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado. It is officially my 3-year anniversary at Security Weekly. I remember this date extremely well. Joining remotely are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, Matt. Congratulations on your anniversary here. I got to watch the Patriots eke one out yesterday while we were walking around doing some trick-or-treating with the kids. So, I don't know.
Nice.
You're going to give me some ulcers, man. We eked it out.
Oh, don't even get me started with football this weekend. Also joining me is my other co-host, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Matt. How's it going today? Nice to be back after a little Halloween trick-or-treating yesterday. Congrats on the 3-year.
Thank you. Yeah, I got on the call this morning. They look at me and they go, wait, it's No Shave November. I said, yeah, but today's November 1st. I shaved this on the 31st of October, so I'm still legit. That's because my costume, by the way, I had an 80s porn mustache for my
Nice.
costume this weekend. And after Halloween, my wife's like, yeah, you got to take that thing off.
Did you go as Ron Jeremy?
We just went as an 80s couple. And so I had to put the 80s mustache on. And anyways, if you're on my wife's Facebook,
you could have gone with
see
Magnum PI or Tom Selleck Magnum PI, but you went there.
Right.
You went there.
Yeah, I had to. Join us for our next live webcast on November 4th to learn about pragmatic steps to reduce your software supply chain risk. Then join us on November 11th to learn the key insights and takeaways from the 2021 OWASP Top 10. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to save your seat. Don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Kyle McNulty is a cybersecurity jack of all trades. He has worked in consulting for several years, most recently leading the cloud security and DevSecOps practices for CDW Focal Point. He also has his own podcast, Secure Ventures, where he interviews CEOs and founders in the space. Additionally, he is a founder himself, building a cybersecurity consulting marketplace to solve problems that he has faced firsthand. Kyle, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's almost like you've done 237 of these in the past. Those ads were looking pretty slick.
Well, the show started before I officially came over. So I think 3 years worth of podcasts is 44 times 3. So that's 132 webcasts that I think I've hosted on Business Security Weekly. When they started this, it was Mr. Santarcangelo and Paul started it back when he left Tenable back in 2016. So yeah, I didn't do them all, Kyle. Sorry.
That's okay.
And I think I came on board at episode 101, I think was my first episode.
Yeah, so you've been on a while too, Jason. Yeah. All right, Kyle, we're going to talk how to build better resiliency, but let's start with kind of defining business resilience and then what can or can't security do to help build a better business resiliency. Let's start there.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, obviously, when you think about business resiliency today, security plays a key role in that. I think that's just proven by how mainstream media and the news channels have actually picked up security incidents, given just the outcomes that they have on the businesses themselves. So if you think about Colonial Pipeline, for example, I'm in San Diego, so the Scripps breach earlier this year was certainly a key one. Business resiliency directly ties into security because security threats and impacts and attacks ultimately threaten the ability for these businesses to continue operating. So again, for Colonial Pipeline, their key capability was to be able to deliver that oil as needed. But in that case, it was actually the safety mechanism that the operators took that threatened the resiliency rather even than the attack itself. So ultimately, as these organizations are thinking about business resiliency, security is one of the kind of key attack vectors or types of events to be aware of.
But it's not the only one. So how do companies prioritize their resiliency strategies, and where does security fall in that priority stack? Because to your point, it is a key component, but it's not the only component. So how do organizations try to address this and prioritize where cybersecurity fits in the overall business resiliency structure?
Yeah, sure. I think one way to think about this for security professionals is almost think about it like a threat modeling activity, right? When you think about something like threat modeling, your job is to consider some of the different types of attacks that might impact your organization and ultimately prioritize out from there based on the impact of the organization, the likelihood, what are the compensating controls that are needed to address that. So from a business resiliency standpoint, if you take the same approach and say, okay, there's different types of threats. One might be a security threat. One might be personnel threat. One might be a very physical, real threat, like an active shooter, for example. So let's go ahead and break down all these different potential mechanisms that will impact our business resiliency, the ability for our organization to continue operating, assess the severity and likelihood of each one, and be able to make prioritization decisions from there.
That's assuming you're doing a threat model.
That is.
I mean, ultimately, I've seen this in action in many instances, and you know, it's very telling. One of our sister companies does mergers and acquisitions, right? They help handle mergers and acquisitions for organizations, and not only are they doing the normal due diligence with financial due diligence, they're going in, they're looking at the physical assets of the organization, but more and more they're starting to look at things like technical debt and cyber risk as part of that upfront due diligence process. So it just shows you how important business resilience is and where cybersecurity plays, to the point where acquiring companies are actually assessing that. Are you seeing that now, Kyle? I mean, again, over the course of the last year or so, I'm seeing it more and more.
Yeah, certainly been involved in several of those, several clients that have been going through that process, both on the buy side and the sell side. And that's one of the key factors that comes into play. I mean, beyond just kind of business resiliency in itself, right? It's okay, what is the risk that's being introduced to this organization, and what are the different types of negative consequences that might be born out of that? And that's going to ultimately impact several different aspects of that acquisition, including, okay, what sort of personnel from the organization are we going to be bringing over? What are how are we going to decide on the kind of uniform technology stack after the acquisition? Is it going to be the acquiree or the acquirer that gets to move forward with these different capabilities that they've built? And ultimately, all of these different components are then going to come back to affect how this organization continues on in the future and is able to address, to your point, both cyber risk, but also these kind of more broad elements as well.
Yeah.
I think it's certainly becoming more, I don't know if it's the norm yet, but it's definitely becoming, I don't know, I'm seeing it happen, right? A lot more. And I think it needs to happen a lot more because the costs of that are starting to become something that people are seeing as a hardline cost in that M&A activity. So, that's really interesting that you're saying you're seeing more of it and you've been involved with it. I'm just wondering, like, if you think about, the prevalence of that, I still feel like that's early stages of companies really trying to adopt that. Do you feel like that as well, or are you really seeing a lot more momentum in that area?
Yeah, I think it's certainly rising along with just activity in the industry as a whole. Like I was mentioning earlier, right? Security is becoming more of a primary concern for just the public in general, and especially executives and boards. So when previously security was maybe something that the CISO prioritized in acquisition, now it's becoming a priority of executives and the boards of these companies, just because they understand more and more how brand reputation can be damaged by one of these types of events. And to your point, I mean, there's more and less formal variations of what this activity actually looks like, right? So for example, if a company is going to look at trying to be acquired, they might want to brush up on their security posture with something like an assessment, just to make sure that they're very touched up in terms of their security practices, their strategy, able to communicate a strong story to that acquirer. However, the other side of it would be, like you mentioned, kind of building into that M&A process. The acquirer, when they're looking at actually buying a company, especially depends on the size of both of those companies, then you would have to go through that full due diligence process of, okay, let's get down to the nitty gritty. What are all the different security controls and practices that are in place within this organization? And how is that going to integrate into ours? What is the risk that's being introduced? How does that affect the dollar amount that we're willing to pay here? So there's different levels on that maturity scale in terms of how security can be involved within that process.
Yeah.
And we have a really good... go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say, Matt, to Kyle's point, I was going to say that's the conversation I'm hearing more and more, is what type of risk would we be taking on, and what's the monetary value around that risk, and then what is it going to take to remediate that, so that way the integration goes smoothly and there's no risk that we're taking on, right? So, in many instances, it's conversations around what's it going to cost to remediate so we can finish the deal.
Yeah,
right.
The point I want to bring out, the one I remember the most for this is the Verizon Yahoo deal, right?
Yeah, that's what
Yahoo had the big breach, right?
Yeah.
And it did impact the price that Verizon ended up paying for Yahoo, knowing that it had exposure for this breach.
Yeah, that's the most public one, right?
Yeah. And the piece that I was going to add too, right, is it's one thing to go ahead and assess the monetary value that's going to be required in order to fix risk and try to remediate it. Okay, what controls are we going to need to implement? It's much harder to actually assess what is the cost of the risk that exists in the organization. So obviously the two don't necessarily equal one another. An acquiring company might not have to remediate all of the risk that exists within that acquiree. That's just the nature of security in itself. As an industry, you're not going to be able to eliminate 100% of risk. And so it goes into that conversation of, okay, what is the risk to our organization? How much of that are we going to remediate? And then somewhat of a best guess in terms of what the end output is going to be in terms of negative impact from an actual dollar standpoint.
Yeah, but that goes along with the rest of the risks that any business is looking at with an M&A, right?
Yep.
I think the change here is really that, cyber is being considered with that stack of risk. And it harkens back to the conversation we've had on, the last several episodes about how, really cyber is becoming a business line driver. And so I think from that perspective, if you think about it as a CISO and you're trying to participate in the business, you have to become aware of how you're going to contextualize that risk for the business, not, as you say, try to eliminate it, but how do you get it to a point where either the business can be comfortable with it and comfortable with the cost of addressing it, or say, this just rises to a level where it's too expensive and maybe it affects the deal at some level.
Yep, to be sure. And again, that's where it becomes a much broader conversation outside of just security itself, as with just acquisitions in general, right? A CISO, for example, is going to have some sort of say in terms of the cost to their team, the actions that their team is going to need to take. But ultimately, an acquisition is involving many more players than just the CISO. That's just the reality of how business works. And so they're only able to have some small piece of kind of say in that ultimate decision. But again, boards and executives are starting to pay more attention to what they're actually saying.
Right. So Kyle, as we think about things that organizations can do to be better in resiliency, where are some easy areas to address it? As we were doing the prep call for this, you had a couple interesting areas where you see an opportunity to address resiliency as part of those processes.
Yeah, to be sure. I mean, as you mentioned, just an introduction, right? I specialize mostly in cloud security and DevSecOps. And I think ultimately those two areas are certainly just key growth areas for organizations as a whole. So, I mean, with the cloud, more and more organizations are looking to the flexibility and scalability of some of these different resources, and more organizations are moving towards DevOps methodologies to be able to deliver software faster and more reliably. But each of those have security considerations that come along with them as well. And oftentimes, folks and organizations haven't quite adapted to these new mechanisms for actually producing software or deploying products. And so security is trying to play catch up. Now, as a result, that leaves a lot of opportunity in these areas, but it certainly can be difficult to actually figure out how to go about those. So there's lots of new standards that have come out that are doing a great job of guiding some of these different folks. There's certainly a big talent gap that exists in both of these areas today. There's already negative unemployment in the cybersecurity industry as a whole, and these two kind of functional domains are certainly no exception there. So it's certainly challenging for CISOs and other security leaders to think about, well, how am I going to address some of these different areas? But thankfully, more and more resources are becoming available.
Yeah, I want to double click on each one of these. Let's start with cloud security, because inherently the cloud is more resilient in some respects. Now, it depends on how you set up your architectures, and do you have multiple zones and other things, but that also creates complexity that can create security challenges, right? Like leaving a misconfigured S3 bucket and the next thing you know, all your data's been exposed isn't an optimal business resiliency strategy. So how do you address some of those aspects of the inherent resiliency built into cloud, but also the challenges when deploying cloud?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a big issue that comes with the cloud, right, is there's this expected resiliency or availability improvements as soon as you stand up cloud resources. But oftentimes, if you're building a robust architecture, it's going to take more consideration in terms of what that actually looks like and how to design it effectively to meet the needs of the business. So if you need very simple uptime standards and it's a very simple architecture like a single VM, then sure, maybe you're fine with some of the defaults. But in reality, how many organizations are actually taking an approach to the cloud that meets those simplest use cases? Well, not many. One of the examples that I've seen in the past with one of my clients is they went ahead and replicated some architectures across multiple regions, but their network security groups that were configured on each of those regions no longer actually matched one another. So even though they applied security best practices on one of those regions when they first set it up, when they went ahead and replicated it to try and make their business more resilient, well, they actually introduced additional security risk and defeated the purpose entirely because they didn't follow the appropriate configuration practices. They didn't have those standards in place that defined what the network security group rules actually need to be for that second region and for that architecture. So I think that's where it goes into just understanding cloud architecture, cloud network design to that next level beyond just when you're walking through the setup wizard for a new resource.
It seems like
Ben wouldn't know anything about that.
No, you expected me to pop in here. I guess that, I've been a fan of a long time. Kind of saying that you can outsource the the responsibility to run it or the workload, but you really can't outsource the risk, right? You still own that risk. And I think that's where a lot of people have failed. And it seems like that's what you're alluding to, is that, people who don't want to do the work or put in the effort think about cloud or cloud security vendors as the easy button, right? Or not just cloud security vendors, any cloud vendor, right? Any managed service provider. They think about that easy button, and it's really not, right? I mean, you really have to dig into it and find out how is that service that you're outsourcing to configured. Are they doing their due diligence? What are their controls and processes? And sometimes that's getting hard to find out because people are trying to, obfuscate that and just say, hey, trust us. But I don't think you can. I think you have to dig into it. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some examples where the easy button is a fair analogy, right? I mean, I think if you think about configuring Kubernetes, for example, using something like ECS within AWS is going to make your life a whole lot easier than trying to configure that from scratch. Taking the control plane responsibilities and all that configuration out of your hands is definitely going to make security much easier. But to your point, there's a lot of areas in the cloud where that's not the case. And so it's not fair as a kind of CISO or security practitioner to think because it applies in one area, it applies across the cloud entirely. For example, right, if you take networking in the cloud again, sure, there's some defaults that are set up, but you have to make sure that you're still applying those appropriate network rules similar to how you would in an on-premise environment. So even though it makes the actual management of that process much easier, you still have to do a lot of the legwork yourself to make sure that it's configured properly.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, just from some examples that I've seen over the course of the last few years, sometimes and many times that easy button was a necessity that had to happen, because look where we were for the past 2 years. I've seen so many, emerging enterprise, mid-market organizations where the viability of their business was dependent on fast forwarding their technology plan by 2 years and going to the cloud as quickly as they could just to keep themselves in business. Now security is an afterthought. So, for me, they don't know what they don't know. And they went into it saying, I need to keep my business alive. I need to move to the cloud. I need to get, my business in a place where, I can continue to drive revenue into my business. Now we're having the conversations around, hey, let's take a look back and say, did we secure this properly? So Some of the cloud migration was just necessity to keep businesses running. And I think as security professionals, we need to, number one, realize that. And secondly, help those organizations get to where they need to be, because so many customers that I work with didn't know what they didn't know. And they moved to the cloud because it was the business easy button, not the security easy button.
Yep.
I 100% agree with that. I think if you think about, again, both of these areas, right, cloud and DevSecOps, they both stem from that business decision, and security is playing catch up. And part of what's making it so challenging for these security teams to really catch up is that you have to think about the culture of security differently in both of these areas. And when developers or operations folks kind of get used to that lack of guardrails, it becomes very challenging to implement some of those security best practices back into place.
Yeah, and we were going DevOps next, Kyle, because it's one of my favorite topics. Because when you think about it, Jason brought up, the issues around technical debt. One way to move forward and to iterate more and to get your business continuing to go is DevOps, right? And businesses have adopted this to continue to push forward with their code, maybe get rid of some of that technical debt, but really serve the business purpose. But that also brings up a whole set of challenges, because you talked about Kubernetes. Well, yes, whether you run it in the cloud or not, Kubernetes by itself is a complex little beast, right? And as you deploy these applications, maybe multiple times a day, I mean, security teams, it's the frequency change that I think puts security at a weird place, right? Because I used to use this analogy all the time. I think it's still valid. I remember back working for Qualys and Tenable when we could get organizations to scan their networks like once a month. Like that was good, right? Think about the number of changes happening with these code releases multiple times a day. Yep. They're not used to the frequency, which creates some challenges to secure and make those applications resilient as well.
And the remediation path is different then too, right? Typically. I mean, you're not talking about the same way to remediate in those environments that you were in a legacy environment where you scan monthly.
Yep. And I mean, on the bright side, right, the tools have certainly adopted this new approach. I mean, as you can see, just the number of tools that label themselves as DevSecOps tools and are focusing on some of those key capabilities, such as continuous scanning on every single deployment. If you think about just the rise in CI/CD pipeline usage. But again, to your point, right, these are kind of core challenges in DevSecOps at this point is how is the security team really adjusting to this new approach where it's no longer about, okay, right before the product ships to production, we're going to do a code review. Well, that's just not sustainable anymore. That's completely blocking this new approach that these other teams are looking for. And again, as security practitioners, we have to remind ourselves that we're working to support the business rather than inhibit the business solely for security use cases. So there's a whole culture shift that comes into this in thinking, okay, I have this great new set of tools. How am I going to integrate this into a process that actually works for the developers? And how am I going to use that on an ongoing basis and support these developers in order to make sure that they understand the value of security within the application, have the tools to actually remediate those issues, and how am I making myself available to support that entire process and lifecycle?
Yeah, and that's where I think Microsoft's acquisition of GitHub and what GitLab's been doing are actually very beneficial to that end state, is because I think both of those organizations have done a really good job of integrating security into the DevOps pipeline, which allows you to get there, right? Because otherwise piecing it together gets much harder.
Yeah, and that was going to be the point I was going to bring up, Matt, without causing friction. Because the last thing we want as CISOs is to say we're stopping have the CEO come to you, knock on your door and say you're stopping the business, right? So it's how do we integrate it without causing friction so those developers don't have pitchforks and torches coming at our door.
Right. And a lot of CISOs would even be lucky to get to that point, right? A lot of times developers are going to have more sway in an organization than the CISO. So if you try to implement a process that's introducing friction, you're probably not even going to get to the point where you can stop the work because it's going to get just immediately rejected by the rest of the organization.
Right, exactly. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
That's been great to be here. Appreciate you all having me.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.